morning to everybody. Good morning for Italy, but like for all the other time zones, have a nice day. Today we will have like a different format with my friend from Australia, Philip Longley. This is Stefano from Italy, and we will approach this session with a different type of format today, because we want to try to make one shorter stream than the previous. So this session, I will give immediately the word to Philip. Will be a presentation about an argument that it could be interesting, because it's about Central Asia, and maybe a point of view about the actual geopolitical situation from Australia. It's a different point of view. In the next sessions, we will have also Defense Politics Asia from Singapore, who will made like the point of view about the situation in Spratly Island, Taiwan, the south, the sea between China and all the other parts like Vietnam, Philippines, and whatever. So if you have any question, I will put on the chat. Please write. I will collect it for Philip. And Philip, I will give you the word. So up to you.
Indeed. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to present here today on the geopolitics of Central Asia, a topic I'm very passionate about. And honestly, I think it is probably one of the most relevant topics at this point in time, given what's happening in the Ukraine. So if we could share my presentation, Stefano, that would be fantastic. So look, basically, I guess in delivering like a crash course on the geopolitics of Central Asia, I wanted to sort of quickly give a quick, about me, like why has Stefano reached out to me and said, Philip, give us a presentation. So in a nutshell, I spent 5 years in Central Asia, spent a bit of time at the Australian Embassy in Moscow, Russia. I was in the Ukraine during the Maidan uprising, and I was in Odessa just after the house fire in 2014. Spent a lot of time studying Central Asia and Eurasian politics at the European University at St. Petersburg, at the Moscow Institute for International Relations, and the American University of Central Asia. After that sort of block of study, I then went and worked in a venture capital fund, which was focused on Eastern European startups, venture capital, and did a lot in Central Asia as well, which was fantastic to sort of see young, upcoming, bright minds with fantastic ideas in a part of the world that is economically underdeveloped. Since returning to Australia, which was quite a while ago now, if I'm being honest, I worked as an advisor to a member of parliament, and then obviously worked in risk and financial advisory as well. I'm currently head of government relations for Engineers Australia, which is a professional body which represents the interests of about 120,000 engineers across Australia. I'm also founder of ATS, which is a startup and venture capital advisory, which focuses on helping basically Central Asian companies or any company sort of land in Australia. The picture that I have there is one of my favorites. So that is me in about mid to late 2016 in the presidential palace in Kabul, Afghanistan. So I'm about third from the left there. And on my right is one of the advisors to the then president, Ashraf Ghani. On my left was one of his top security advisors. So that's sort of a little bit about me. And I guess one to contextualize sort of all that I'm saying comes through that lens. So in terms of what does a crash course in the geopolitics of Central Asia look like, there was sort of 3+1 major trends that I wanted to communicate to you. Some of which, for those of you who are very interested in geopolitics, some of it might be a little familiar to you. But really what I wanted to do was to provide sort of 3 different lenses that you can apply when you hear bits and pieces about Central Asia. The first being the Great Game. The second, how that impacts on the Ukraine war. Some internal trends that are specific to Central Asia. And then what a destabilized Central Asia might mean if that is an outcome. And then I'll conclude with a brief talk, I guess, on what an Australian perspective on sort of our geopolitical situation is here. So the Great Game is quite, I think it's overdone at this point, very popular, but it's important to sort of contextualize Central Asia. So obviously that was the British Empire versus the Russian Empire the British having sort of colonized India and what we would now know as Pakistan, the Russian Empire having essentially proceeded from north to south as well as from west to east during one of their great expansionary periods. They were sort of, I guess, competing over control of Afghanistan. Now, the British fear was that the Russians had plans to sort of expand into India, which it looks like they had plans, but were never really had the resources to execute on. And Russia's fear was that the British would just continue to expand north. Central Asia became a proxy for essentially other macro conflicts taking place. And really, I think a lot of conflicts throughout the world, you can see Central Asia being some sort of proxy, a sort of a space where great powers can compete via proxy without having to sort of put their troops on the ground or sort of commit resources significantly. The Crimean War, I sort of debated with myself whether I should put that in. I'm putting it in because of obviously its relevance to the Ukraine, although it doesn't necessarily sort of have direct relevance to the Great Game, but it's sort of important in terms of the context. The map there is obviously Central Asia, and sort of the green space, if you like, was that area of great contest. So if you're interested more about the Great Game, give it a Google. It's very fascinating in terms of the history. In terms of the new Great Game, so that was something that was very popular really not that long ago, although I think as a concept has really dated now that the Ukraine conflict has really taken off. But pre-Ukraine, essentially the idea was you had the three great superpowers vying for supremacy: the US, China, and Russia. In terms of a Russian context on Central Asia, they obviously have a mass Soviet legacy. So they were very efficient, and some might say brutally efficient, in making sure that Russian was the lingua franca of Central Asia. So I have traveled to all of the stands with the exception of Pakistan and Turkmenistan. And Russian, you can get by with Russian without a problem. That means that in terms of media consumption, if you only speak Kyrgyz and Russian, or you only speak Uzbek and Russian, your natural media sources tend to be Russian focused and therefore maybe a bit more pro-Russian. There are a lot of media, like local media outlets throughout Central Asia, but a lot of them tend to just be sort of reprints of basically Russian mainstream media. That's changing a lot at this point, and I do think you can see that misinformation is rife, but also sort of the conflict of narratives, of media narratives, is being played out in Central Asia as well. There's a good PhD topic in that for somebody who's particularly keen. In terms of other Soviet legacies that are relevant, so everything from their military organizations to their institutions, the education system, the textbooks they use, the buildings they use, the way they build buildings, just everything is really still very much in the Soviet sort of context framework, and not a lot has changed in many regards. I mean, obviously there have been sort of updates and so on, but for a lot of in a lot of areas, the Soviet legacy is still very, very strong and very tangible. Another key, I guess, context to sort of keep in mind is US interest in Central Asia really was decreasing. Again, we're talking about pre-Ukraine, really was decreasing after the decline of US interest in Afghanistan, given that that is now essentially a concluded conflict. You really have to wonder what is the United States macro game plan for Central Asia. When I was there, Afghanistan was a very real conflict. We got a lot of students went to my university who were from Afghanistan. Look, in terms of, I think at its height, the United States had bases in both Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, which were used as sort of transit points before troops and weapons and material would then land in Afghanistan and be deployed. So that was sort of an interesting caveat. One of the interesting, I think something that, again, needs to be looked into a little bit more, and for your viewers, maybe that's a challenge I can throw out to them, is when the United States was sort of starting to pull out, a lot of the weapons, material, and resources, particularly in Uzbekistan, was sort of left there, sort of as a thank you, but also it's pretty unclear what the government of Uzbekistan has been doing with those resources, with those weapons, for example, post American withdrawal. So that's an interesting area that, again, remains a bit of a question mark. In terms of Chinese influence, If you're looking over the long term, I think that's really the play to be keeping the closest eye on. Their influence is growing. You can see the Belt and Road, which is no doubt something that, if it hasn't come up on your show, Stefano, I'm sure it will more and more often. You can see the main Belt and Road, or one of the main Belt and Roads, because it's a network, goes through Central Asia. So many of the best roads that sort of I drove on, and remember this, in a country like Kyrgyzstan, a lot of the roads aren't great, but the best ones were always built by the Chinese. And interestingly, they were always built by Chinese workers. Another great, I guess, anecdotal piece of evidence as to the rise of China's influence is China actually bought territory from Kyrgyzstan and added it to the territory of China on the border there. I just want to quickly go back very briefly to the first slide, just so I can show sort of in terms of definitionally, what do we mean by Central Asia? Traditionally, that's just the five. So Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. I would note, just look at the countries around Central Asia. I think that is particularly indicative of how unstable the region is and the kinds of players that try to gain influence. So Iran in Tajikistan is a big influence. China, I mean, just look at the borders. They're fascinating and very challenging, particularly if you can look between Kyrgyzstan, which is the 1, and Uzbekistan, which is the 3. I mean, it just looks like a really squiggly line, which causes a lot of issues and headaches. So look, in terms of, that hasn't formulated great, but in terms of what does the great game look like now that the Ukraine war is happening? And this isn't something that's been really looked at a lot, and I think that's because it's still relatively new, but essentially the Ukraine war fundamentally recontextualizes the great game. Central Asia is really geographically on the periphery of this conflict, but there are significant repercussions for Central Asia. Economically, Central Asia has been hit by the ruble going down. A lot of trade in Central Asia, their main trading partner was Russia. So now Russia's sort of fallen over. That leaves a lot of Central Asia in serious difficulty. And that means there's a great opening there actually for China or the United States, frankly, to sort of come in and support businesses, support innovation, startups, all that sort of thing. So that's something to keep at sort of the forefront of your mind. Brilliant. In terms of other sort of areas as to how sort of the Ukraine war and Central Asia connect, it's interesting that I think because most Central Asians speak Russian, and that's the majority of the media that they have access to, in the conversations that I've had, and that's very anecdotal, and I accept that, but in a lot of the conversations I've had, they tend to be naturally sort of a little bit pro, right? As in pro-Russia. There are exceptions to that rule, but that's generally been what I've seen. It's been good that I think that macro Russian narrative has been challenged and it's continuing to be challenged. But that's certainly been something that I think, in terms of studying the media landscape of Central Asia, should be given a lot of thought, and more research needs to be done in that area. Another interesting frame, and again, I'm trying to, I guess, equip your audience, Stefano, with different sort of frameworks and proxies that they can use when they hear about Central Asia, is the populations in the Caucasus. So the most famous of those obviously being the Chechens, and sort of their involvement in the Ukraine war. Whilst there are significant, really fundamental differences between the populations of Central Asia and the Caucasus, there are also a lot of similarities in terms of them being Muslims, sort of quote unquote colonized by Russians, having sort of an ethnic language, but also predominantly for business, politics, literature, and so on, operating in Russian. So the Chechens are an interesting proxy for how the rest of Central Asia might think and view the rest of what's happening. In terms of anti-Russian sentiment in Central Asia, I thought this was an interesting sort of caveat. It's not something that is perhaps widely researched as much as it should be. But Uzbekistan is a fascinating example of a country that has really, on several occasions, tried to sort of push Russia away, push away sort of the Russian motherland and the Russian yoke, and sort of stand on its own 2 feet. They have a very proud sort of ethno-nationalism there, which is quite sophisticated, and is an area that I think, in terms of, it's important not to see Central Asia as just one homogenous block. It is sort of very complex ethnically and sort of across the board. In terms of a post-Ukraine conflict world, I think it's important not to discount the idea that Central Asia could be another conflict zone. I say that on the one hand because given Russia's tendency to annex former territories, you've got a huge border with Kazakhstan, and that northern tip is mostly populated by ethnic Russians. So that's an interesting dynamic there. But also, as the United States and the West really looks for ways to sort of get back at Russia or God knows what, Central Asia could provide an unfortunate opportunity there. So that's just something to sort of track in terms of media and so on at a low level. In terms of Afghanistan, I really wanted to return to this. And these are two of my favorite photos. One of them's cut off, unfortunately, but the one on the left is me with the then president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani. And on the right, it's me with the chief executive, Abdullah Abdullah. The chief executive role was fascinating in the sense that it was a position created to ensure a balance of power between different ethnic groups, essentially. So whilst this is a bit of a generalization, the chief executive represented sort of the north and that Tajik north, whereas Ashraf Ghani tended to sort of represent the rest. And so that was a fascinating power dynamic. The government obviously wasn't that functional, and the long-term fallout from Afghanistan on Central Asia, I don't think we've seen. It's somewhat disappointing, to be honest, that media attention and the world's attention has gone away from Afghanistan, but it's important that we continue to track it because we don't know how that's going to impact and destabilize other Central Asian states. And that's important because if you look at the flow of guns, drugs, narcotics, refugees, all of that will naturally go north, and that can have serious implications for Europe as time progresses. The other interesting, I guess, caveat to note is looking at Russia and Chinese influence in Afghanistan. So the Chinese certainly had a number of interests in some mines that were there in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, that was something that they were seriously looking at. I think most of those projects have stalled at this point. But again, China is always generally looking for proxies and ways to sort of get an edge, and that could be an interesting angle for them to go at. The other sort of, I guess these were sort of a cluster of issues that I just wanted to raise. On the right is me with General David Petraeus. In my view, post-Petraeus, Afghanistan, really, that was sort of the end of sort of the idea that the United States could win. After David Petraeus, it really looked, certainly to me, that it was, the decline was imminent. The end was nigh. In terms of looking at Central Asia, there are certainly in Kazakhstan fears of Russian intervention and a general suspicion of the United States writ large. Oh, I think we just lost my slides, Stefano. Oh, we're back. Thank you. Sorry, so then in terms of Central Asia and NATO, I think there's some interesting opportunities there. Again, in terms of looking at ways to support and help organizations and communities in sort of like that NGO space. The color revolutions, it hasn't formatted there brilliantly, but essentially there are 3 color revolutions that I would flag, which I think form quite an important part of the Russian mindset and why the Ukraine has developed. So the Rose Revolution, the Orange Revolution, the Tulip Revolution, these almost conspiratorial or pseudo-factual revolutions were sort of influenced by the United States, orchestrated by the United States to get pro-American, pro-Western regimes. Internal trends, I'll just go through these really quickly, but essentially the idea of the rise of ethno-nationalism. So that, if you're a Kyrgyzstan for the Kyrgyz, and you should only speak Kyrgyz and you shouldn't speak Russian, that's quite a new phenomena within about the last decade. The deterioration of the middle ground in terms of fundamentalist Islam being on the rise, or being quite sort of pro-West and quite cosmopolitan. So that middle ground is deteriorating rapidly. I'll leave what a Soviet Muslim is for another day, but the idea being that there is growing polarization in Central Asia. If we get a destabilized Central Asia, what does that mean? I think the best sort of anecdote I can give is with ISIS, where the second largest group of foreign fighters actually came from Central Asia. So after the Middle East, it was Central Asians who were going to join ISIS. And that's because of poverty, that's because of destabilization, that's because you've got very dictatorial governments. And, if you've got nothing else to lose, that's, where they went. And that was quite a significant stream of groups. And ISIS had significant recruitment media in Russian. And that's something that, again, isn't looked at a lot. In terms of other conflicts that are sort of going, right now there is alleged ethnic cleansing of Pamirs by the Tajik government. Take a look at the Gorno-Badakhistan region, which is sort of your northeast. There was the 2010 ethnic cleansing. There are ongoing border skirmishes between Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and the list goes on. So really, I guess, to finish the Central Asian section, we will forget about Central Asia only to our peril. We need to ensure that we keep Central Asia at the forefront of our minds and keep supporting not just sort of freedom and democracy, but really see if we can find alternative ways to support business and enterprise. Now, Stefano, did you want me to talk about sort of Australia's geopolitical situation? Do we have time? Yes? Fantastic.
Yes, and then I'm collecting the question for you. So
brilliant.
Talk about Australia, that is very interesting.
Brilliant. So look, second crash course is on the geopolitics of Australia. My guess is very few of you have ever studied the geopolitics of Central Asia, so I will do my best to give you a quick rundown. So the map on the top right basically shows Australia, where Australia is situated in relation to China. Those little circles in the middle of the map are the military islands or bases that China has built. On the left, it's just a great little graph which shows, how many troops does Australia have in comparison to China, the United States, or Indonesia, Japan? How much do we spend? So we spend, 23 billion compared to 220 billion. So there's just, an order of magnitude there, which you'd expect. But the reality is, in terms of Western freedom-loving countries, Australia is the closest. New Zealand takes essentially a pacifist position. So they have essentially no military whatsoever, which makes Australia's position even more challenging. In terms of, I think really the three key things that I would keep at the forefront of your mind if you ever have to deal with the geopolitics of Australia. The first is the ANZUS Treaty. So that is the agreement between Australia and the United States that in the event of a conflict, the United States will come and help Australia. It is not written anywhere in that agreement that the United States has to help us, only that they will intend to. So it's an intentionality, not sort of a must agreement. The second thing that I'd keep at the forefront of your mind is AUKUS. So that is the agreement between Australia, the UK, and the United States. And that's essentially, it's a deepening of a military alliance, but also the military industrial complex. So Australia is upgrading our submarines, our Navy and maritime fleet, and that's central to that. Prior to AUKUS, we had Naval Group, which is a French company, essentially building our submarines. And that contract was cancelled, much to the dismay of the French president, who was not very happy with Australia. The third thing that I'd keep at the forefront of your mind is to sort of look at the US bases in Australia. So we have 9 or more, definitely 9, possibly more. It's uncertain. We don't know how many, but that just gives you the idea of the closeness of the relationship. The other thing that is super interesting is the Australian Antarctic Territory, which is administered by the Australian Antarctic Division. So Australia claims about 42% of Antarctica, which it's significant. It's a lot of territory. It's in terms of, if you were to overlay a map of Europe, like that would be a significant chunk. In terms of Australia, again, in terms of Australia, China, Russia, this is probably one of the few areas where two behemoths really, and poor little Australia, actually come into contact. So there you can see the Chinese bases and the Australian bases, and the Russians have significant commercial fishing and other, commercial interests in that area. The Antarctic Treaty Organization is an agreement that basically freezes any military or commercial use of Antarctica. But the treaty ends in 2048, which is coming up. So we'll see what happens then. A lot of the bases that you see there are dual-use bases. So that means that the Chinese can use them for scientific or military purposes. That is all I had. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm also happy to explain this particular photo, which is a sport in Kyrgyzstan called kokboro, and it's headless goat polo. So there are 2 holes in the ground, 2 teams on horses, and you've got to get that headless goat into the into the hole. So that was just an interesting thing to end on. Happy to take any questions, Stefano, but appreciate your time and the opportunity to speak today.
Yes, so let's start with the questions. I have something from the public. So, first question was before the presentation. So let's start. It's generally it's not about Central Asia, but we will talk about everything. It's Charles K. What, if you are open to answer, did you see that the Maidan protest, are the accounts presented by Oliver Stone and the Russian side accurate? If you see.
Yeah, so look, it's a great question. I can only talk about what I saw. What I saw was mass carnage. I saw a lot of destruction. Clearly, a lot of people had died. In terms of, were there snipers on buildings and that sort of stuff. I didn't see, so I can't comment. That's just what I saw, but clearly there was significant violence and conflict that happened at that point. Certainly, there are so many competing testimonies and documentaries and so on. I think the real takeaway, to be honest, is looking at sort of the long-term outcomes of these organizations. I do think Pravi sector, or the right sector, they were a very, very significant presence when I was there. And certainly when I was just walking around the streets, there were a lot of those people walking around with the black and red flag. And so that's just, it's very anecdotal. And that's all I've got, unfortunately. So that's the best non-answer I've got.
Philip, I was there in Ukraine, in Kiev 1 month before Maidan, but for another purpose, because I was organizing an international school of politics in Florence, and I was meeting like the youth wing parties in Ukraine, and the sensation was the same. I think that in any case, all the information, it's like from one point of view. So if we talk about the point of view of Russians, they said that it was a coup d'etat, blah blah blah, whatever. So, but the sensation that I had, it was that for sure there was a sentiment that was against the treaty with the Eurasian community instead of the European Union. But for sure there was a lot of influence about the right wing parties, private sector. And whatever. So it's a very complicated issue. So let's move to the next question. Okay, in a recent interview on YouTube by Vigilance Elite Channel, Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, claimed that the Chinese were in Afghanistan mostly because of the presence of Uyghur.
So Charles K, I love your question. So definitely in looking at Central Asia and why is China getting involved and what are they doing in Central Asia, definitely looking at that through the frame of, well, what are they, how do they view the Uyghurs?
Philip, only to add to the question because it was not enough space. Okay, and they paid the Taliban government to suppress VN. Do you find this claim valid?
So look, as to whether those claims are valid or not, I don't have the information. That's not something I've looked into. But in terms of, I think, let me sort of take value from the question here, taking a step back. It is absolutely valid to look at Chinese influence and action in Central Asia through the lens of how they are dealing and engaging with the domestic Uyghur population. So the Uyghurs, for those who aren't familiar, they are naturally a Central Asian ethnic group. Some people would say there should be sort of a Uyghur Stan, and that would sort of complete the stans, right? There were a number of Uyghurs that I had the privilege of meeting. They are great people, very kind, generous, hospitable, can thoroughly recommend Uyghur food and cuisine. But in terms of, what's happening there, clearly that's one of the greatest humanitarian crises that nobody is talking about. There were definitely, sort of when I was in Afghanistan, there were some military people that were trained by the Chinese. But what that was motivated by, perhaps only the Chinese know that.
So let's move to. I have some questions from the previous panel that were like, especially also about Australia, because there was a question about the problem that could be in, for example, for the countries that are producing energy with nuclear powers. The problem that could be about uranium, and if, for example, if Kazakhstan is blocked by Russia to export to West, like the question that was like, could be Australia a good supplier of uranium instead of Russia and Kazakhstan for the Western nuclear power plants?
Yeah, so look, short answer is absolutely. So we have a lot of uranium reserves in Australia. Australia is, in terms of our economic structure, like mining is right up there in terms of our top, three things, right? In terms of Australia, at this point, is not a country that uses nuclear power. That's a very contentious issue. A lot of Australians are against using nuclear power. So that's a sort of an interesting caveat. In terms of conflict in Europe, particularly the Ukraine, opened a lot of opportunities for Australian businesses, because essentially a lot of what the Ukraine does in terms of raw materials, Australia also provides. So now I think there are a number of businesses, particularly around the agriculture and agribusiness sector, that Australia now has pivoted and is providing Europe, albeit at a premium because of the distance it no doubt has to travel.
So one that is made by your experience. This question is from like an Italian politician that sent to me by WhatsApp.
Oh, good.
So it's about Central Asia. That it's your opinion about the Turkish influence versus Russia and China.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question. So ethnically, they are part of sort of that macro Turkic ethnic group, right? That all came from the Altai Mountains. If you don't know where the Altai Mountains are, Google it. It's a fascinating, almost pseudo-spiritual place for the Turkic peoples. And if you're actually really interested in some of the, where the Turkic ethnicities went, the Korean ethnicity also traces its links back to the Altai Mountains, which is fascinating that was such sort of a genesis for so many different ethnic groups. There is the idea of pan-Turkism, which is still around. So that's the idea that all the Turkish nations should sort of unite into this big European Union, but sort of Turkish empire sort of thing. It's a great idea. It'll never happen because there's far too many competing influences. But in terms of who has the most influence right now, I would say Russia. In terms of who will have the most influence in 20, 50, 100 years, probably China. And the Turks will always have this sort of deep connection and this deep brotherhood, but I just don't think Turkey has the economic or military resources to really capitalize on those at this point. But they're still there.
So, main question for DPA, that is like one of our speaker, that is from Singapore. So very difficult question as usual. So how much is the threat is the new Taliban Afghanistan to the Central Asian countries? Because the military for quite a number of smaller one are pretty negligible. Will the instability in Afghanistan spill over?
Yep, brilliant question. So in some senses, I guess there are two parts. I feel like your question implies, would a Taliban government try to sort of expand the territory of Afghanistan? I think that's unlikely. The Taliban have said they're not going to do that. They're just interested in the independence of Afghanistan. They've achieved that, so I don't see them trying to, take parts of Tajikistan or something like that. Although, in terms of general instability, so maybe if the Taliban government is dysfunctional, or you get a lot of refugees, which we've already seen, or you get the flow of other weapons or unhelpful items, then that could be a destabilizing factor. We also saw, Al-Qaeda were in Afghanistan. And so, who's to say that you couldn't get a resurgence of terrorism using Afghanistan as a base? That's definitely an option. So I see it sort of destabilization by proxy rather than seeing a Taliban Afghanistan really trying to come out and sort of expand their territory.
Perfect. So this is, I don't know nothing about this argument, but it's next to you. So let's see. Is it clever? No, this is by the West send development aid to Afghanistan currently. Europeans do.
It's a great question. So look, I think the important thing is what sort of aid are you sending? Is it sort of food, water, electricity, etc.? Is it purely humanitarian? Is it propping up an incompetent government? How much are you spending vis-a-vis aid to other countries like, the Ukraine? To be honest, I don't think, my understanding is Australia is not sending any aid at this point. Whether it's clever or not, I think depends on if Europe can have a long-term plan to engage with Afghanistan. If they do, if it's strategic, if it's clever, then sure. But I haven't seen or read anything that is deep and meaningful about what is Europe or the United States' plan for Afghanistan going forward. A lot of it looks very short-term. A lot of it looks very sort of happy-clappy. So look, unless there's a big plan, it's probably not clever.
So, can you give us an update on Solomon Islands, Chinese bases, from where you are?
So is that Jigs? Is that an I or is it JLGS?
JIGS.
All right, Jigs. Well, you're obviously following Australian media fairly closely, so kudos to you. Essentially, so the Solomon Islands, let me give a bit of context for everybody else. So Solomon Islands are a group of islands that are very close to Australia. If you were to sort of imagine it, it sort of sits halfway-ish between, close to Australia and China, right? The Chinese the Solomon Islands president came out and said, oh, by the way, we've signed all these great agreements with China and we're going to build, possibly some military bases there, or maybe not. And Australians freaked out and sent, some of our top ambassadors and diplomatic personnel to try and figure it out. I'll be honest, I haven't heard a lot since then. Unfortunately, Australian governments have successively failed to engage with our immediate neighbors. We've never done a particularly good job of engaging with Indonesia or the Solomon Islands or Fiji or any of those guys. It is a real, it's tragic, and it's come to bite us now because, here we are facing off against the fairly militant China, and we've got these bases right on our doorstep.
I have two questions that are connected. So let's say the views that it's okay. Central Asia is a Caspian, a Sierra Lake. Why this is important? I will, and the other question that is connected about DPA. Okay. So, is Azerbaijan more European or Central Asia? And what is really Azerbaijan trying to achieve strategically? It seems to blow hot and cold with Russia and problems with Armenia.
Well, look, thank you, Defense Politics Asia. That's a great question. Traditionally, so on the very first slide, a traditional sort of view of, what defines Central Asia. Azerbaijan is not usually included. So I would say it is not Central Asian. I'm not an Azerbaijan expert by any stretch of the imagination. So I think what I'll seize on in that question there, it is a good question. It is just not part of Central Asia. But Armenia obviously has long-term ties with Russia. In terms of the Armenian population and diaspora, like there are so many Armenians in Russia. So Russia tends to play both sides of the conflict. But please don't take my word for it. Have a look online at Russian weapon sales to Armenia and Azerbaijan, and you'll get a pretty clear picture of the situation there.
Yeah, and if I can repost this picture from the previous stream, it's very interesting that Azerbaijan have a strict connection, for example, for about the oil and gas export to Europe. Now we already saw this situation because now, and we will move to Ukraine. The safety about gas import in Europe, now it's moving from north to south. So this is why in Italy it's very important in this situation because, for example, we made a lot of agreement, for example, with Algeria and especially with Azerbaijan, and probably Italy will be used as it was Germany for Nord Stream, to not only for gas to Italy but for all over Europe. And this is an important thing, because you can see, and this is why the question of Caspian Sea was made. For example, and the other part of the sea, and nobody asked to you, but I will ask to you, there is an important thing that is Turkmenistan. And but so why the Caspian Sea for the Russians is a lake and for the others is a sea, in your opinion?
Yeah, mate, look, it's a great question. And I guess I'd answer to this in three parts. Part one would be to say that in terms of traditional Central Asia, these pipelines, once they sort of leave Turkmenistan, it's out of the Central Asian territory, right? In terms of why is it a lake or a sea, Stefan, I think you touched on it pretty well in terms of some of the illegal claims on certain oil and gas fields. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Turkmenistan is a fascinating country. It's the one that I could never really get into, right? And just for tourist reasons, right? They would never give me a visa. They are really like the North Korea of Central Asia, and in quite a scary way, to be honest. And a lot of other Central Asian countries can be challenging to get a visa, but you can kind of get there. Whereas with that one, very, very locked down. Turkmenbashi was a fascinating guy. And now I believe it's his dentist is now the president or something wild like that. So look, that's not a great answer, but I think obviously it all comes down to the legal questions of
but I can agree with you. Like the main reason that it's claimed a lake, it's because technically, if it's a lake, you need the approval of all the countries on the lake to move a direct pipe. So this is the technical reason, because Turkmenistan want to export directly to Azerbaijan and attach to the tap to export.
Yep.
And historically, Russians from the Soviet Union want that all the energy resources pass through Russia magically, so they can cut off when they want. This is the reason why, for example, the tap and the Baku-Siyan pipe from Azerbaijan to Turkey was very difficult to make, because it was an agreement during the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it was still Soviet Union existing, but the companies made the agreement directly with Azerbaijan. So it was very complicated. So we have some other questions. So,
I mean, if I can add to that, and I know we're running out of time a little bit, but as an Australian sitting here, it always blows my mind that in Europe, for some reason, it's never occurred to strategic planners that getting the majority of your, oil and gas from Russia was a problem. So the fact that this has all come around to sort of bite the Europeans, it's fascinating that nobody's thought of fail-safe measures, and instead, a lot of European countries are getting blackmailed, really, right? Isn't that essentially what's happening? And as an Australian, it's fascinating to sort of sit here and think, did you guys really not have a plan? I mean, feels like basic geostrategic planning 101, right? So just a comment from your brother across the sea.
Okay, let's say only returning back before a question. The main problem is the same that you said before about all the countries that is around Central Asia. Like the Mediterranean is not historically a very stable part, let's say. So we have to choose between the less worst partners. Not because before, for sure, I think that the first part of mandate of the first two mandates of Putin, Russia was more, let's say, affordable and a partner that could be better, for example, than Libya. So this is the main reason. If you check to the pipes to Africa, like Tunisia is okay. Algeria is okay, but still not a champion of stability. So
Stefano, always have a plan B, especially when it comes to critical resources like oil and gas.
Now imagine that in this case, the best countries, it's very strange to say. Now, yesterday they made an agreement that I don't know if in Australia's news arrived this thing, but all the European countries will start to reduce the gas consumption minus 15% for, I don't know, indeterminate time from 31 of August this minus 15%, it's made to save gas from storage, especially for Germany. This problem is that Germany is the country in with more problems now, because it's completely dependent from Russia. And in a strange way, we already talked about in the last stream, for example, Poland is not importing any more gas from Russia because it's cheaper for them to import Russian gas through Germany. So it's strange things in Europe that is coming. The two countries that has less problem with this, it's like Spain and Greece, because the most part of the gas that is imported from them is GNL. So they don't have any problem. They can import from everywhere, and without any problem of supplier, because they can choose. You have problem with Qatar, I take from USA or from whatever I want. Okay, this is also DPA. I have last 2-3 questions, and then we will see. What is the current situation of AUKUS for Australia? Is French-Australia relationship still able to return to good? I don't know nothing about this. Or this is a new divide between Europe and UK, US, Australia. What is AUKUS strategically to you?
Okay, so this is a great question. And look, I think to provide a little bit more context, because I touched on it very briefly, but essentially what Australia had a multi-billion-dollar deal with Naval. That was the French essentially submarine company, and they build submarines. We'd signed a contract. That contract had been in effect for many years. And then literally overnight, the Prime Minister of Australia, then Scott Morrison, cancelled the contract. He said, we're done. And instead, we're going to get the Americans and the British to build our submarines for us, right? And by the way, they're going to be nuclear-powered submarines. So that Emmanuel Macron then leaked a lot of texts that were confidentially sent by the Prime Minister of Australia to Emmanuel Macron, and relations between Australia and France hit an all-time low. We now have a new government in Australia, the Labor government led by Anthony Albanese. So this is a left-wing government, or more left-wing than the government previously. And there's a great photo of them shaking hands. So Anthony Albanese and Emmanuel Macron shaking hands. And so now sort of everything's good again, at least at a surface level. I think deeper down, clearly there's still a rift, but at least there's amicability and some form of friendship has been rebuilt. In terms of what it means to me, I think it's fantastic. I think we should have done that in the first place. I'm a big supporter of AUKUS, and I think it'll be better for Australia in the long run, alongside the United States and the UK.
Okay, still another question about Australia, a lot of curiosity. So can you please give some updates of situation regarding coal with China, Australia, China, plus Australian mining company discovering the biggest diamond in Congo?
Yep, so Zukski, love your name. Thank you for the question. So in terms of, I think you're probably talking about some sort of trade challenges there in terms of exporting coal to China. So look, there continues to be challenges between Australia and China. There have been sort of mini trade wars with some key industries in Australia. The Chinese have done that every now and then to try and bully Australia into shutting up about the Uyghurs or into towing China's line on a particular political issue. Australia and the Australian mentality is always to sort of speak truth, even if it's uncomfortable. We don't mind, just saying it how it is, even if it gets us in trouble, and it does. And so China sometimes comes at us and tries to strong arm us into, shutting up. We never do. We'll always be on the side of freedom and human rights and whatever. In terms of the diamond mine discovery in the Congo, I haven't really heard about that. Sounds interesting, and I'll look it up.
Okay, we are collecting the last question from the public, but this is one that I had before. So TTP agreement could be resurrected also for the European Union after the Ukrainian conflict to make the Western trade community, because let's say as we talked also before about Brexit, that with the Brexit maybe UK could be, let's say, more next to American Australian community about trades and blah blah blah. TTP agreement in Europe was very, let's say, there was a huge conflict in the political community, especially for the import, for example, of grain from Canada or whatever, blah blah blah, and whatever, because the market about food in Europe is completely different than in Canada or US, with the use of hormones or genetic modified grain or whatever, and now in Europe, it seems that TTPA could be, let's say, resurrected, but to be less dependent from unstable countries. What is your point of view?
Yeah, look, so I think the TPP received a lot of support from Australia, to be honest with you. Australia is quite a free market economy in terms of our agricultural sector. It's very competitive. And one of the interesting things about the European Union is that they deliberately try to keep Australian agricultural products out of Europe. Because we're very competitive and we can sell better quality cheaper. And so there are a lot of tariffs around that. So trying to get rid of that would be great for Australian farmers, Australian manufacturers. It would be fantastic for us. I think one of the reasons why the UK is now engaging in AUKUS and the rest, all these other great partnerships is because they've realized that their future, if it doesn't lie with Europe, they've got to sort of go back a little bit and say, hey, what about Canada, the US, Australia? It's essentially the Anglosphere, right? And as an Australian and from an Australian perspective, that's fantastic. It also helps the UK's pivot to Asia and the United States' pivot to Asia, because this, Asia is where all the economic growth is going to be. It also happens to be, unfortunately, where a lot of the geopolitical instability is as well.
So, okay, last two questions, and then we will close. So we'll stay in a very short stream today. Okay, this is like more US politics about Southeast Asia, about Pelosi and chips and Taiwan. I don't know nothing about chips, but I know that China was trying to block in somehow in some way the visit of Pelosi in Taiwan.
So look, I think the chips and the semiconductors are sort of the two big things that Taiwan manufactures. So essentially, what does the annexation of Taiwan look like from an Australian perspective? It's horrible, right? Because that's right on our doorstep, right? That would be the equivalent of the Ukrainian war if you were living in Europe. So that would be an absolute disaster for Australia and really for everyone. I've heard different scenarios played out, but everyone seems to be saying China's going to try and annex it soon while the world is distracted with the Ukraine. I hope that's not the case, but if it is, there's obviously going to be more global instability and more disruption to global supply chains and logistics and the rest of it. I think were they to execute on that plan, we would all be poorer. We would all basically, look back during our COVID days and think they were the good old days, right? Because it wouldn't end anywhere good. That's for sure.
No, I think that in this case, Chinese will be cleverer than Russians, because it's very interesting about the alliance between Russian and Chinese. I already said in other streams that, for example, for China, Russia, it's only 2-3% of trades, and only Europe, European Union, and US, it's at least 40% of the export of China. So everything. I think that everything that is connected to China is connected to business and long term, and they're not emotional. So I think that this situation in Ukraine, it's very far away as a story. We already posted that in 1991, the head of Gorbachev said that if Ukraine will be independent, there will be a problem with the borders with Donbass and Crimea. So it's nothing new. It's a thing that it's very far away from the history of the border of the Soviet Union. So let's give you, I already posted before, but only for the public, a last update. There is a lot of news today. I will not say to you because the stream, it's live, but the most part of viewers saw it after on YouTube. But the news of today, there is, it seems, a big operation of Ukrainian on the southern border in Kherson. So let's see what will happen. I didn't say any prediction about the conflict in Ukraine, but today I think that I will say mine. In my point of view, the good deal for Russia will be to maintain the initial public goals like Donbass and Crimea. It was not for me the official goal, because the official goal was like the replacement of the Zelensky government and the annexation of all the southern part of Ukraine till Transnistria. I think that it will be very difficult to achieve now. So it could be possible, but with a mobilization, and we talk a lot about it. Russians don't want to make mobilization because they don't want to make any problems in Moscow and Peter or in big cities. Actually, the most part of the troops is from the eastern Russia. It's not from the European part. So the Russian people don't feel the war a lot inside the cities. So it could be a good deal for everybody, because Crimea could be recognized as part of Russian Federation internationally, and Donbass, such a kind of the other frozen conflict that still are in like Azerbaijan and Armenia with Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Transnistria. But let's see what will happen.
I'd add to that. I'd say, from the West, I see two big perspectives. What you just said from your France, your Germany, basically continental Europe. The other perspective I see coming more from the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, just because we kind of follow, our big parents. But essentially, that the Ukraine should keep fighting. They shouldn't settle to sort of bleed Russia dry, right? So I can see that. Also as quite a strong dominant theme coming from the United States and the UK. And I think, interestingly, those two strategies, really it comes down to Zelensky and what he wants to do. So I wish, he needs a lot of wisdom to figure out what he wants.
Let's give to you only this last thing, and then we will close it. This is like one interesting map that I already showed before. It was previous the starting of a special military operation or war in Ukraine, call whatever you want. And this was like the interesting part of the communication. This was from Crimea. So in my opinion, there was like these two claims. You can say like you are Russian speaker, so you know what does it mean. But for the people who don't understand, it's like a declaration that is like citizens of first level, second level, third level. And you will see that if we return back to this map, probably the initial goal of Russia was this map, not Donbass, Crimea. It was that one was, it could be because the results in Donbass, for me militarily, it's really achievable from Russia fastly. So without a lot of problems, they can take Donbass and whatever. But the southern part is more difficult because it's very long way to Transnistria, and I think that Odessa, it's something that Ukraine cannot lose, because without the access of the sea, Ukraine is like a completely bankrupt state. Also with the European Union help. The last thing about the official data of Russia, that it's statistical data of today. Officially, it was yesterday. So we can see that this is real data from Moscow Statistics Institute, Russian Statistics Institute. There is, I will send the link to the YouTube channel. So we can see that this is the real situation. The production, it's pretty collapsing. If we have some data like this one in Europe, it could be like completely disaster. But in Russia, nothing is talking about it. You see that the problem about high prices, it's in a long term. If I have a decreasing of production of 33% of gas, it means I'm using the right moment with high prices, but you cannot close the pipes. So you still have the pipes full, but you are not selling it. Production of cigarettes minus 32%, cars minus 90%. Why? Because actually there is not one normal producer of cars that is completely Russian. Also Lada, that is the biggest producer of cars, it's Renault, it's not Russian. Lead batteries, cables minus 80%, fridges, elevators, trucks minus 40%, and Russians are good in trucks producing because they have a lot of brands. So for sure, Europe is not in a good situation. I think that, as we already said, we are not having an increase of GDP as we expected months ago, but we are still increasing. We are not decreasing. And so this data could be interesting to make analysis of what will happen. So this situation, Philip, if you can say your point of view, I think that both sides are trying to draining the opposite.
Yeah.
But the problem is that both sides. I'm saying Europe and Russia, but you have also US that is not drained by this situation and is giving a lot of, let's say, suggestion, but not having any pain about this situation, and exporting a lot of GNL, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So
I mean, look, if it's a war of attrition, Russia will lose. It will lose because its economy was smaller to begin with. It will lose because I mean, it's tragic, but and it's awful for your average Russian on the street, right? I have lots of friends in Russia, and their businesses are closing. If you're a young professional, you're trying to leave. So many of my friends are leaving Russia right now, and they're the ones that worked at KPMG, they worked at Morgan Stanley, they worked at these great firms, and they're just leaving. And they're going to Europe. They're going to Europe because they're educated, they're connected, they've got money, and they can do it. But for those who don't have that, they're kind of stuck there, right? So the future economically is really tragic. And I hope, as I'm sure you do, that there will be a peaceful solution as soon as possible, because that's ultimately in everybody's best interest.
I think you're right. I have the same. I have a lot of friends in Russia, So I have the same thing. Like a lot of high-level professionals, for example, strangely moved to Uzbekistan or Georgia, or
Kyrgyzstan,
example,
Armenia,
Montenegro. I don't know. The easiest way to move with any problems with the same company, with subsidiaries, for example, in Uzbekistan or whatever, and they say to me, for example, that Uzbekistan it's like with the same power of Russia during the 90s. So for them, were like very challenging and very interesting to move, because it was like with for sure not an incredibly democratic country, but with more choice at the right moment. A provocation that I can give to the public, like to close, I think that we still don't understand, except, for example, Philip lived many years in Russian-speaking community, and also Russia. I went in Russia for many years, merely 1-2 months a year. I stayed in Russia for many reasons that I will not tell you, but I'm kidding. So like to make a little bit of suspense. So no, I think that we don't understand the level of proudness of Russians. So if the economy is collapsing, they will not cry. They only decrease their level of life. So without complaining, like Europeans, no. This is the problem that I think. I think that the real mover of the balance will be Germany, because trust me, actually they are still starting to prevent the people. You will not be able to eat a lot this winter. The winter is coming. A lot of I think that the fear of cold winter in Germany could be a super pusher to make Zelensky agree in a sort of deal. as you said before, I think that the big problem of Zelensky is internal, not external, because if private sector or the Azov regiment and whatever, they don't want to make an agreement with the Russians. And if you have like these right-wing parties that they can kill you in the street. So let's see what will happen. Let's see from the panel if there is anything else. Okay, no, we are okay about the questions. The last closing also okay for you, and then we will close the streams.
Fantastic. Look, this is a great question to end on, and I just wanted to say, if anybody's listening and wants to shoot me another question, feel free to do so on LinkedIn. I'm Philip Longley on LinkedIn. So my prediction for the Central Asian map in 100 years, I think that's really tough, you know. My hope is probably better. My hope is that there's some sort of confederation. You've got the free movement of trade and people. I think you need that because you've got so many ethnic diasporas from all the different Central Asian states in the other countries. I think if the Central Asian states can ever pull together, they can be a real force to reckon with. And you know, during the Islamic Golden Age, they were one of the beacons of enlightenment. So my sincere hope is you know, it returns to that. I know there's a lot of talent in that part of the world, so I'm gunning for them and hope they do very well.
I can agree with you. I will leave the public with 2 suggestions and 2 next streams. Thanking you for your time. So what you say to me, it's very interesting because I have like this book that is very interesting, The Last Empire, Sariploy.
Great.
It's where I found a lot of information very interesting about the timing of collapsing, and it's from a former Soviet citizen, because it was like it's Ukrainian, but like Soviet is not young now. It's a professor at Harvard, I think. And he was talking that during the collapsing of the Soviet Union, especially in the 1991, when they were to make an agreement between the Slavic Union, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, they were still making such a kind of agreement between the Central Asia and the Muslim republics. The only one that didn't want to make it because it was connected to Gorbachev at that time was Nazarbayev, Kazakhstan, and wanted to still have some connection with Russia. But all the others, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and whatever, they wanted to make such a kind of an alternative union that was not the Confederation of Independent States. It was something that so I agree with you. The last suggestion that I said to you, there is another book that it's this is like the US point of view. It's not completely new, but it's very interesting because it's this one. It's like Return to Winter, Russia, China, and the New Cold War against America. This is the US point of view, completely US, but it's very interesting because a lot of things that we were talking about, it's realizing. And about the next stream, that could be very, very interesting, and it's connected also to your stream, Philip. So I will give you an invitation. So if you can participate to a question and answer, this is like one of my best author about. Let's say that time of chaos during the last 80s and the beginning of the 90s. We will make the 1st of August Central Eastern Time 1:30 p.m. And it will be with Steve Levine, and that is a former journalist. He made this book about the old and the glory, the pursuit of empire, the fortune of the Caspian Sea. It will be very interesting because he lived, I think, 15 or 20 years in Soviet Union and Russia, and now he's living in DC, in Washington. But and his wife is from Kazakhstan. He has a very, very interesting personal history because. For example, he had also some issues about one American journalist that was killed in Pakistan's France during 2002. So I will have a lot of histories to talk about on field, not like only on paper. So this invitation is for all of you, August 1st, 1:40 p.m. It's very difficult to have it online. So I think that if you have any question about the Caspian, Soviet, the Russian government, he made also an interesting book about Putin. So please be free to put the question on the stream. So under this video, if you have any question for Philip, I will forward to him. So put it in the comment. We will prepare and I collect the question for the next streams. So. Thank you, Philip. Stay after I will end, but thank you all. We stayed in a new format about 1 hour. I hope that you appreciated. I will look at the statistic to see if this format it's more let's say appreciated than the longer, but and so we will adapt stream on stream to make your views better. Thank Philip and thank to all the public, and see you in the next stream.